Strap in, because this is the story of a man who treated Russia like a parking lot he could just walk into. 1812. The most powerful man in Europe, a guy who'd already steamrolled half the continent, looks at the largest country on earth, a place famous for eating invading armies for breakfast since the Mongols, and decides the smart move is to go in anyway, with zero winter gear and a supply chain held together with optimism. He marches in with roughly 600,000 men. He marches out with somewhere around 27,000. That's not a military campaign. That's the worst group trip in recorded history, and nobody even got a group chat to complain in afterward, because most of them didn't survive to complain. By 1812, Napoleon had already conquered most of Europe and forced everyone into his pet project, the Continental System, a trade blockade designed to economically strangle Britain by banning anyone in Europe from doing business with them. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, tired of wrecking his own economy to punish a country he wasn't even at war with, quietly starts trading with Britain again. Napoleon's response to a former ally simply going, "Actually, no," wasn't diplomacy. It was assembling the largest invasion force the continent had ever seen. Somewhere, a therapist weeps for the road not taken. The Grande Armée wasn't really French. It was French, Polish, Austrian, Italian, German, Dutch, a sprawling multinational coalition of roughly 600,000 men, all speaking different languages, all loyal to varying degrees, all about to discover that fighting for Napoleon and fighting for your own country produce very different levels of enthusiasm once the temperature drops below freezing. It's the biggest army Europe had ever fielded, and also, structurally, a group of strangers who'd never agreed to road trip together being told the destination is Moscow and the return ticket is optional. Napoleon's entire career was built on winning fast, decisive battles. So naturally, Russia's generals look at this and decide the correct response is to simply not give him one. The Russian army retreats, again and again, burning crops, villages, and supplies behind them as they go, leaving the Grande Armée marching deeper into hostile territory with nothing to eat and nobody to fight. It's the military equivalent of a passive-aggressive roommate refusing to engage in the argument. Except the argument is a war, and the silent treatment is several hundred miles of scorched earth. Napoleon finally gets his battle at Smolensk in August, captures the city after brutal fighting, and discovers the prize is a smoking ruin the Russians burned on their way out, stripped of supplies, with most of the population already gone. Congratulations, you won. There's nothing here. It's the historical equivalent of finally getting the promotion, only to discover the office is being demolished next week and the parking spot doesn't exist. In September, the Russians finally stand and fight at Borodino, and the result is the single bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars, somewhere around 70,000 casualties in a single day between both sides combined, a number so catastrophic that modern military planners still use it as a benchmark for this is what hell looks like on a battlefield. Napoleon technically wins. The Russian army retreats again, intact enough to keep retreating, and Napoleon is left holding a battlefield carpeted in corpses and absolutely no closer to actually ending the war. A win, in the sense that losing slightly less than the other guy counts as a win. Napoleon marches into Moscow expecting a formal surrender, the keys to the city, maybe a parade. Instead, he finds it almost entirely evacuated, and within days, the city catches fire, deliberately, most historians agree, likely set by the Russians themselves on their way out, rather than hand their old capital over intact. Napoleon sits in the ashes of Moscow for over a month, waiting for Tsar Alexander to come crawling back with a surrender offer that simply never arrives. It's history's most expensive case of staring at a phone that refuses to light up, except the venue is a burned-out capital city and the stakes are several 100,000 lives currently running out of food. By the time Napoleon finally admits the surrender isn't coming and orders a retreat in October, it's already too late to beat the weather. The Russian winter arrives in full force, temperatures plunging far below freezing, and an army that marched in with summer uniforms and no real cold weather plan starts disintegrating in real time. Starvation, frostbite, and typhus tear through the ranks faster than any Russian regiment could manage, while Cossack cavalry harassed the stragglers the entire way home, picking off the weak like the world's most efficient cleanup crew. Nobody packed for this. Nobody even checked the forecast. The campaign's final horror show plays out at the Berezina River in late November, where engineers build hasty pontoon bridges under fire so the remains of the army can cross before Russian forces close in. Thousands drown, freeze, or get crushed in the panic to get across, and the bridges themselves are burned once the last stragglers are through, sealing the fate of anyone too slow to make it. Of the roughly 600,000 men who marched into Russia that summer, only a fraction, commonly cited around 27,000 still combat-ready, make it back out. The rest are dead, captured, or simply gone, swallowed by a country that never had to win a single decisive battle to beat the most feared army in Europe. It just had to wait. 500,000 men, one wounded ego, and a country that won by doing absolutely nothing. The GPS said turn back in July. Nobody listened.